Clarity by Dragonson, Chapter 2, Eyes. Alright, please settle down. The chatter died suddenly as the man stepped up on stage. He was glad for this because normally he'd have been able to rely on Glinda to announce his presence, but his professor was still a little miffed at this decision, to say the least, and it followed that this announcement was anything but normal. So, do you think this is about what happened yesterday? Hush, Ruby. We'll find out in a second if you just be quiet. The newer students obviously were less disciplined than the others, but Ospen could still see the older teens and younger adults fidgeting uncomfortably on their feet all the same, and he could not blame them, for it was not lightly he assembled the student body together. I'll keep this brief. There was a few nervous chuckles as some recognized his default opening, but they would be the only ones for the remainder of his speech. Though it may not seem like it, what I will say more of a public safety announcement than a history lesson. With the crowd and the confusion, Ospen heard a grunt of disappointment. He found Oblique easily enough. His professor, Doctor, towered over most students and was obviously disappointed at the headmaster wasn't going to be revealing any of the other sordid details here. This is because while many kingdoms have done their best to erase this story from the history books at one point, myself included, this has not stopped it from becoming relevant once again. As some of you know, he nodded towards the first years who made to cower into the darkness of the amphitheater. We had a little incident at initiation yesterday. I should be clear that it was nothing to do with the incoming class, and that in fact the prospective students involved imported themselves as best can expected. Dim lights hid their collective chagrin, though they were happy to note that a few older students nodded, acknowledging them. However, I fear this might not be an isolated incident, and so it is only right to prepare you all moving forward. Though he had promised to keep it brief, Ospen cleared his throat and settled into the proper composure for storytelling. Huntsmen have long since been seen as a symbol of hope for our society, the guiding light for Remnant. It only follows that this bright light casts a long shadow. I will break my own rule here and digress into the past slightly. You all should know by now that huntsmen and huntresses have existed since before the kingdoms officially formed. To this day, no one knows precisely when the specialty for even the title came into our common vernacular, but it has not been far want of trying. Many of our best historians have tried to track down the first huntsman to little success. This is probably because the history of hunters is non-externally tied to the history of Grimm, which still remains so much a mystery. On the opposite hand, the other career, which formed around the same time, has a well-documented history that collectively the kingdoms have done their best to bury. Why, surely you must wonder, how could this be true when it has been omitted from all your lessons to date? A secret group as old as the initiation of hunting. Surely the old man must be going senile himself. There was no laugh at his suggestion. No one rose to the bait to poke fun at their headmaster. Sadly, I know this story for a fact because I was alive when they vanished. I know how that they simply hid and were not eliminated like we all believed. I see we were fools to ever believe they had been beaten to begin with. How could we destroy something that had been beyond around for as long as humanity and faunus? How could we then ever hope to conquer sin? How could we ever banish our own shadow? For so long as there will be humanity, there will be the assassins. You have all dedicated yourselves to fighting the menace known as Grim, but by this point in your lives, you will realize that there are other monsters out there disguised as people. There are those who have made the same sort of vows to exterminate this scourge without any of the thanks or honor bestowed upon our warriors of the light. I'm not asking you to appreciate these assassins as you do your fellow students. I will not expect you to get used to them, and I do not even desire you to accept that there are young men and women your age who are taught to take a life as one takes Grim. However, you must know, you must be prepared to encounter these people and understand that they are every bit warriors whose skills and even pride are on par with your own, with your own. For more than that, they are people, human beings, and faunus like you and me. Unlike we know more about why they have returned and what they intend, you need to keep this fact foremost in your minds if you should find yourself dealing with them. Exercise extreme caution outside the school walls from now on, and above all, patience. That is all. You are dismissed. So you don't seem all that surprised. There had been a somber silence as the students had funneled out of the auditorium back to their own business, which excluded classes and settling into their rooms for the newly included. But as the newly formed Team Ruby rounded the corner to their hallway, the blonde bruiser couldn't hold her tongue any longer. Her target was her dark-haired partner who had gone back to reading her book the moment they were elbow to elbow with a tide of students. Why should I be? Blake shrugged, flipping a page. I am perfectly willing to believe there's a group of humans out there who kill others for money. The real world's not as pretty as Beacon's campus paints it. Frankly, I'm most surprised at you, Yang. I didn't think you were as innocent as Ruby. Hey! Hearing her name, the red-cloaked girl hadn't caught what was said, but knew enough that she was being compared unfavorably to her sister. That's Captain Ruby, by the way. Right, like you'd ever let us forget. Her reluctant partner and even more unwilling subordinate gripped. How a naive little girl like you even got in this school is still far more shocking to me than those ruffians will ever be. Hey, lay off my sis, Yang barked at the Harris. And where do you get off calling someone naive? You weren't even there. Hmm, it's not like I haven't seen them before. It was a good thing Weiss was in the middle of the group when they all stopped, or else she would have walked right on by without noticing their shocked silence. Even Blake had the decency to drop the spine of her book enough to look over it. What? You just said you've seen them before. Yang quoted, pointing an accusing finger at her sister's partner. These assassin guys. You're sure? Of course I'm sure. Weiss huffed, turning her back on her team, but also a part of her past she'd rather leave there. Past she'd rather leave there. How could I ever forget? Should have figured a Schnee would have dealings with those kinds of people. Blake dismissed while simultaneously glaring holes in her book. I would never. Shocking them for the second time in as many minutes. We's assertion was said with such ve- vehemence, vehemence that she surprised herself. She blinked and looked away at the floor in mortification. Weiss turned back to her team to see them leering intently at her. I can't. As an afterthought, she added, not here. Okay, first off, back in the security of their dorm and away from the prying eyes and ears, Huis had lost much of her hesitation and ramped up to full lecture mode. If she was going to work with her team, they had best know exactly what this latest development portended. Yes, I've known about and even seen the assassins before. They're still around in Atlas and even been for some time. But no, I have never, will never, and don't want to be associated with anyone who fraternizes with their lot. Then what about your dearest father? Blake sniffed disbelievingly. Killers for hire sounds like something right up Jack Schnee's alley. Though she'd like to deny the slight against her family, Wish could not utter a word against it and simply settled for grinding her teeth in anger. You're not wrong, she admitted, at last getting her animosity under control, which is why it's a good thing no one from our family is allowed to associate with them. Anticipating any of Blake's follow-on snips, Weiss explained further. It was the first thing General Unwood did when he came to power, shortly after my grandfather died and he took over the company. He barred any Schnee, living or future, from contracting the group. I don't know much about how the deal portrays to them, only that it was conditioned for the assassins to reform legitimately under the new government. I know they also have a litany of protocols and paperwork that someone has to go through before they can be hired. Paperwork? Cross-legged in front of her bed, Ruby looked as appalled by this revelation as legalized murder. Yes, paperwork. Ruiz rolled her eyes. Alas, Atlas would have crushed them long ago, of course. I still say they have no business tolerating such blackguards. So why do they? Appearing bored with the proceedings, Yang was in fact as appalled by the whole deal as anyone else. Profit, Blake surmised, power, control, the usual reasons. Despicable, Yang chimed in. Her sister was oddly quiet on the whole matter, apart from her earlier outburst. Yes, they are, Weiss agreed, shocking the lot even though they knew her stance on the matter. Though the SDC is prohibited from their contracts, other corporations are not, which is why when I take over my grandfather's company, I am going to see that they are barred from all industry agreements. Ospen claims that we can't kill them, but just maybe we can starve them out. Admirable. Still unconvinced, Blake was the only one not looking at the Schnee with any kind of approval. But that still doesn't explain how you crossed paths if you're really supposed to be so disassociated. The two girls held the staring match for an uncomfortable long time while the sisters looked on in helpless confusion. Finally, Weiss relented. With a sigh, she realized that she might as well in for a penny. 2 pennies on the eyes of the dead man who stared up at the ceiling with empty eye sockets. She shuddered. It was about 10 years ago. My father had taken me along to his public celebration when he became CEO to show me off. Daughter, come here. She had been having a one-sided conversation with a nosy duchess who preened every time we said something halfway intelligent and smelled too much like potpourri. The young girl was only too glad to get away, but with anyone other than her stern-faced father, who all but dragged her through the throngs of overly dressed people, their garish trappings made the man's plebeian get-up all the more conspicuous, even though Weiss thought he would fit into any dull office space in Atlas. Although there wasn't even a glass of champagne in the man's hand to show that he was trying to fit in, he just stared at the awkward father-daughter pair as they approached with a bored expression in his unamusing face. Exchanging no names, but only a tight nod with the man, Jackie kneeled to Weiss's level, and in a rare moment of solemnity and consideration, he told her, Weiss, I'd like you to meet someone. She looked over his shoulder at the man she was supposed to become acquainted with by face only. Apparently, his head was canted in a question, but his bespectacled eyes bore straight through her father as if he weren't even there, and straight into Weiss's fragile little heart. If someday I end up dead, this will be the man who kills me. The roles were reversed now. Now it was everyone else who regarded Weiss with disbelief, while the dark-haired girl held something akin to understanding before she turned and hid it. There were a couple of more times after that. Corporate functions, a couple of threads, happenstance. Though it was like she was reciting a grocery list, it was clear that each time was incised in her memory. Quite honestly, they scare me. Every time I'm anywhere near them, I just want to get away as fast as possible. They're all horrible, but I'll never forget that first time. Waiting patiently with solemnly at the end of Weiss's confession, Yang cracked a smile. Eh, it's perfectly alright, Weiss. No one ever forgets their first time. You, why, you filthy, cackling, and with her experience as a huntress in training, with her experience as a huntress in training, Yang darted away from the wrath she had incited. It was safe to say the Weiss was livid, not even thinking about using her semblance to catch the blonde as she bounded around the room. It was also safe to say that she, along with everyone else, was momentarily distracted from the subject that still weighed heavily on their minds. Even if they knew it wouldn't go away, it was nice to be able to forget who they were, what they were trained to be, and the world that awaited them outside their dorm. It had been a hard first day, and they hadn't even had class yet.